Hey all you DIY philosophers out there in YouTube land, and welcome to my video from Charlie Kirk to Antifa, the use of the term fascist. The idea basically in this video that we're going to explore is that since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, a lot of people have been saying that the left simply use the term fascist as a way to talk about someone they don't like, or worse still, to justify or legitimate violence and or murder against such a person. And so that's the issue we're going to be examining here, whether there is a more or differently substantive use of that term available to the left, and I guess by extension full stop. Housekeeping, I thought it was kind of urgent to get this vlog out there, so I haven't bothered setting up my ring light, etc. So I'm just going to put some images up that I think are relevant to what I'm saying, but the same images will be up for quite a while, and that frees you up to go and toddle off and do the dishes, or otherwise negate the difference between everyday life and theorising, as indeed you should. Alright, let's get into it. Since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, it's often been said that when people on the left use the term fascist, they do so either without much meaning or simply with ill intent. Now, let's see if this is indeed the case. Now, in order to try and define fascism and get into the definition of fascism, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to define left and right. And I'm going to do this in a really basic way. And we'll need that because for this vlog to talk about how the left uses fascism, we're going to need to have some handle on those terms, left and right. So I'm going to use the left in a very broad sense, and that is that someone who is plausibly represents themselves as anti-capitalist, is moving in an anti-capitalist direction, or is actually anti-capitalist. And that gives you a sort of this spectrum, which is useful in these kind of discussions, between kind of a soft left, which would be like plausibly or starting to move in an anti-capitalist direction, and a harder left where, they're pretty solid about what they believe, and it's like the capitalism has to go ASAP. Now, moving on to the idea of the right, I'm just going to say they're not left, because that's just easy, and we don't need anything else here. Again, there's a spectrum here, so you might be like, oh well, we have to a certain extent, the left's wrong because we have to a certain extent accept what's around us. We can't do anything to change it. To someone who's like rabidly, no, the left's totally wrong. Capitalism's the only way to go. And so again, you get this idea between sort of soft right and hard right. It's sometimes said that hard left and hard right are the same, but I never found that a very convincing argument. What seems more likely is that there's a point at which the soft left and the soft right kind of cross over each other a bit. Let's press on from that. It might be thought, well, look, at this point you've got this idea of the hard right, and ostensibly what you can get out of my definition of the hard right, of right and left, and the consequent understanding of the hard right is that they're rabidly pro-capitalist. And one idea could be, well, look, we just say that's what fascists are. But the problem with that idea and that approach is it doesn't explain why we use the term fascist. I mean, why don't we just stay with hard right, or something which means the equivalent? In colloquialisms, you get things like right of Genghis Khan, or wing nut, right wing nutter, or arch conservative if you want to be more formal and neutral, and so on. So why not just simply use these and not use the term fascist? And the answer, of course, could be, well, look, the reason is because, the left misuses the idea of fascist, but really what they mean is rabidly pro-capitalist. But that's to beg the question against the left. This idea that we could just use fascist to refer to people who are rabidly pro-capitalist and hard right does bring up the notion of the historical specificity of the term fascist. It must have some kind of specificity, and the specificity must come from history in order for us to want to use it, rather than words denoting hard right, and rather than necessarily begging the question against those who are using the term. Even if we beg the question against those using the term and say, well, look, it's just this term which designates people that people on the left don't like, then the question is, well, why that particular term? And so inevitably we have to turn to this question of historical specificity. The argument that when the left use the term fascist, they do so only to dismiss people they don't like, or to justify, to legitimize or justify violence. That's not entirely a new argument. The bit about legitimizing violence is sort of new, I guess, kind of, or at least it's been more emphasized more recently. But that idea of the term fascism is an older one. Now, I first encountered it actually in a more substantial form, and I'm going to talk about a friend of mine, Phil Crotty. I'll put a link to a write-up I did of him after he died back in 2012. Now, what Phil believed about the term fascist was that it's misused by the left, but he thought for a bit on a bit more of a historically grounded basis. What he thought fascism was a movement that occurred in Europe, and it arose at the end of the First World War. Phil didn't say this, but I would say it arose in response to, say, for instance, the Russian and German and other revolutions, and as a reaction against those revolutions, and it struggled to come of age during the 1920s, managed to seize power in the 1930s, and was defeated by the Second World War in the mid-1940s. So that's a trajectory there, and we know the countries where the obvious examples of the countries where fascism took this form, and that includes obviously Nazi Germany, but also Mussolini's Italy, having a slightly delayed timeline. We can think of Spain and Portugal. So what Phil thought was that if you referred to a fascist without referring to someone caught up in that period leading up to the mid-20th century, you committed an anachronism. You were referring to someone who is you were using a term which was out of date, effectively. And what he believed was that the left were kind of lost in time. They were sort of like, I mean, when we first started talking about this was in the 1990s, the Action Surreal days. So at that stage, the left were kind of like 40 years out of date. Like they were looking back at a struggle, the Second World War, which had ended over 40 years beforehand, and the mopping up procedure was presumably, Phil believed was fairly well over by the time of the mid 20th century. Now, Phil's explanation of the misuse of the term fascism by the left is better, I think. I'm not saying I endorse it. I don't endorse all of Phil's ideas by any means. But for now, we can recognise it's better than the criticism of the use of the term fascist, which is more current. And that's because it gives us a historical grounding of that term fascist. And in fact, the historical grounding is quite important because it even allows us to understand the origins of the word. Mussolini was inspired to the term by reference to the Roman fasces, or fascio littorio, a bundle of rods tied around an axe, an ancient Roman symbol of the authority of the civic magistrate. So a nostalgic reference to the Imperium Romanum there, and a further historical contextualisation. So what I called Phil's definition, the highly restricted historical idea of what it means to talk about a movement, a fascism as a movement, or a fascist as a person in that movement, is that we get these paradigm cases. So we certainly, whatever definition we might be able to come up with, we certainly don't want it being the case that, say for instance, Mussolini's Italy isn't fascist. We don't want them coming out not fascist. I mean, there would be something wrong with that, with our definition. Equally, we wouldn't want anything that was too unlike Mussolini's Italy coming out as fascist. But we would want things like, say, Mussolini's Italy coming out as fascist, say, for instance, Nazi Germany, or later on the regimes of, say, Franco and Salazar in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. So we get these kind of paradigm cases. Now, another thing that comes out of that is that we wind up with the potential to generalise outside the historical movement that's referred to in the Phil argument on this matter, on account of the fact that if it's the case that there are essential characteristics of fascists, and that these exist outside the paradigm cases, then if there are characteristics which are necessary and sufficient for someone to be a fascist, and that's how we have a definition, a phrase is necessarily and sufficient to fit what's being defined, then surely we're entitled to use the word. Now, it seems to me that there is such a condition, and that is that you are building a bigoted infrastructure. You are proposing and building a bigoted infrastructure. Now, I'm not going to say national infrastructure, because while those movements did propose a national infrastructure, at one point they were street movements. And I think it's just more important that those, so in the 1920s, as we found out, that those at that stage, those movements had an infrastructure they were trying to build. For instance, the SA, Ernest Romm's SA, was part of the pre-national infrastructure of Nazi Germany and was more useful in the 1920s street fighting phase than it was in the national when Hitler managed to take control of the German nation state. And as a result, they were purged not long after Hitler did that, the SA. But we still want to say the SA were fascist, clearly. So I'm just going to say building a bigoted infrastructure. And this seems to fit a lot of things that it's okay to call fascist. Like, for instance, this seems to fit not just things like death camps, but also things like segregated schooling and bus rides and border policies and so on. Now, you might think that having this definition of the bigoted infrastructure puts a lot of weight on the word bigot, and it's doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. And you might say, well, you've just gone from one word, which is hard to define, fascist, to another. But I think we can unravel bigoted pretty well and pretty easily. So bigoted is an irrational prejudice. Now, you might object to this. Well, hang on. You're talking about you're yourself being prejudicial by saying irrational. But that's not exactly right. And the reason why not is because where it's necessary to underwrite, theoretically, these prejudices, it's done on an openly irrationalist basis. And that basis is, of course, Nietzschean. It's the concept of the ubermensch. And I strongly recommend, if you want to know more about this, that you watch my vlogs. I've only got 2 of them up, but I'm making a 3rd one. You are not the ubermensch. And so what those vlogs say is that you get this concept of truth, where instead of objectivity, which is an idea of objective truth is an idea irrespective of our desires, then you get an idea of truth as a way of asserting yourself over others. And from that perspective, it's not simply the right that are irrational, it's a lot of the left as well. So a lot of the left also underwrite themselves on, use a Nietzschean way of underwriting themselves. And what you get is the same irrationalism. It's irrational not in the sense, or not simply in the sense of being that adopting it is not the best course of action. It's irrational in the sense that it's an open and explicit rejection of rationality as we have it in terms of that notion of objectivity, which is a traditional notion of rationality, that one acts in a sense which is objectively the best way to act. And once you get to the left, what you actually have is, in this sense, irrational agonism. An irrational agonism where all different groups are kind of competing, and they're trying to, especially if they're groups that have been traditionally marginalised and oppressed, they're especially trying to throw off the yoke of the less marginalised and oppressed groups, like white male middle class, and all of this is based on Nietzsche. So that's what's actually going on in the left. You get an irrational agonism as opposed to an irrational prejudice. I mean, if you want to look at the current US admin and their sort of white supremacists, you'll pretty quickly see that they openly avow Nietzsche and the big lie. And the same thing was true of Hitler, especially through Martin Heidegger, a philosopher who put Nietzschean ideas into a more nation-friendly perspective. And so I think that this idea of irrational prejudice is a good way to underwrite bigotry, and then the bigoted infrastructure becomes the proposing and building of a bigoted infrastructure becomes the definition of fascism. And even proposing a bigoted infrastructure is to start building it. So let's not worry too much about the difference between proposing and building. Now, it might be objected to this. Well, that means that there's racists that don't propose the building of a bigoted infrastructure aren't fascists. And I'd say, yeah, it's probably true, right? There's probably racists out there who don't really do much about their racism.
Now, some of this is going to be kind of casual racism, right? And when they're confronted with the consequences of what they stand for, the fact that other people are going to oppose them, and logical arguments regarding their position and so on, they could well cease to be racist. And I've certainly experienced that, both as a person, as a young man. I was attracted to racist ideas, but also in others as well. And this kind of gives sense to this idea of kind of casual racism. So let's lay the definition out. Fascist, DFF, or definition, someone building a bigoted infrastructure. That's it. That's the definition. It's not rocket surgery. I'm happy with it. I've got a glossary page where I put definitions on different web pages, so we're all on the same page, so we can kind of try and cut through some of the confusion that's started to exist in the human conversation, especially on the internet. And I'm going to be putting that up with a link. Fascist, someone who is building a bigoted infrastructure. Oh, I should add as well, fascism, a movement of such persons. That's individually orientated, but I'm okay with that, because even though we're putting fascists before the movement of fascism, where in fact the individual motivations might be secondary, we're at least not buying into any kind of discussions about, we're at least not having to buy into debate with what they call methodological individualists. And I'll put a link down to methodological individualism if you're interested in following up if you're interested in following up on what I mean here. So I'm happy with that, and I'm going with it. Now, it might be objected that, look, when people talk about fascism, they don't automatically think about bigoted infrastructure. Okay, that's something you've imposed. And I wouldn't say it's something I've imposed. I'd say it's something that it's there, but it's not always explicitly recognised in the definition of fascism. And we will come to examples of why not shortly, and to examples of what other concepts displace this idea of building a bigoted infrastructure. The first thing I want to say about this is that there's a role in philosophical analysis for what they call explication. And what explication is an attempt to improve on definitions that are either implicitly or explicitly out there, or to refine characterizations into definitions. And shortly I'll come to some refinements that my explication of the definition of fascism makes. So I'm going to read to you a short description of explication, and I also am going to recommend to you that I'm going to paraphrase it. It actually comes from Jill Russell's book, Truth by Virtue of Meaning. Her chapter on definitions towards the end of the book I think it's chapter 6, is certainly worth reading. The chapter stands alone to some extent. You don't have to read the whole book if you're not interested in the subject matter of analytic truth, which is what the rest of the book's about. But certainly today, it's worth reading around on definitions as best you can. And I think this is because, it's not just fascism. It's a definition that has been poo-pooed, that a word that's been poo-pooed is not capable of any or of a useful definition. It's also anti-Semitism, and there's a lot of argy-bargy around the definition of that word. Maybe that can be handled by a different vlog. Okay, I'm paraphrasing the quote of Carnap on page 149 of that book. Making more exact a vague or not quite exact concept used in an earlier stage of logical development, or rather, replacing it by a newly constructed, more exact concept, belongs amongst the most important tasks of logical analysis. We call this the task of explicating, or of giving an explication for the earlier concept. Now, of course, you can't just totally ride roughshod over earlier ideas or definitions, because then, at best, what you would be providing would be a homonym or a homophone. But what you can do is remake what's gone already. And hey, that's easier, right? You're not starting from scratch. As Lautremont says, plagiarism is necessary. Progress implies it. It holds tight a phrase, uses expressions, eliminates a false idea, and replaces it with just the right idea. Slight paraphrase again, and a link to that quote if you want to hear it see it in the original. It's a bit older than Carnap. Carnap's mid-20th century. That quote's 1870, I believe. So what we get then is an explicated definition. And what we want is a definition which... All definitions give the necessary and sufficient conditions for what is defined. Now, we can call what is defined the definitum. Okay, it's the definitum. And so the definiens, which is a phrase equivalent to the word, which is the definidum, is a logical equivalence. And it's a logical equivalence on the basis of making that word more clear. And hence, we open up the possibility there of explication. Now, what we really want is that our definiens can be unpacked further. We don't want too much stuff in our definiens, right? A definition doesn't have to be a 1,000-page document, right? You want it short and sweet, bang, right? So you can put it on like the glossary web page, just a phrase even, or a short sentence. And then what we want to be able to do is unpack stuff from that. Now, if we take the definition of fascism as the building of a bigoted infrastructure, where we can unpack that word bigoted quite nicely, I believe, and it's a good word. There's a few problems with the left not liking that word a few years ago, but I argued with them as socialists in the left. I argued with them and sort of won them around. But yes, it's a good word, bigoted. So we unpack that, and one way to do that is to be able to take previous characterizations in particular, but also, if required, insufficient definitions of the past, and improve them. And if we look at sort of like some of the characterizations of fascism that exist up on, say, Wiki or Encyclopedia Britannica, and I'll put a couple of links there, we see that we can do this. And that's because those characterizations often rest on the notion that fascism is a authoritarian movement. And that certainly does come out of what our definition is. Why? All right. Let's go through that because it is kind of important. Well, it is bloody well important, not kind of. Okay, so with fascism as the building of a bigoted infrastructure, what's required is that people start constructing an infrastructure which is specifically meant to harm or even kill others. And if they do that, right, we find that they're putting their own lives on the line. Why? Well, the others who they want to harm and kill, for a start, aren't going to be too happy with it. And other people aren't going to like it either. For instance, the left's going to see it, and I would say for what it is, as an attempt to divide and conquer and to scapegoat others, and to therefore destroy the solidarity needed perhaps to get certainly I would say needed to get a better world. And as well, people just don't like a society where they go out and see socially vulnerable people targeted. It's just not a good look. And it certainly worries people in terms of their own self-interest as well, as in the most excellent Niemöller poem, and I'll put a link to that. So in that poem, no one spoke out when they came for the Jews, no one spoke out when they came for the socialists, etc., etc. And then finally they came for me, and there was no one to speak out for me, right? So it's a great poem, and I think it encapsulates valid worries around the building of a fascist infrastructure. So that means that these worries can't just simply be dismissed. It means that fascists are going to face opposition. And sure, and we're going to come to the example of Charlie Kirk shortly, and some other example. The other examples are a little more murky, but we'll certainly be thinking about this. Well, both the examples are murky actually, but we'll certainly be thinking about this. So that means that the gangs or the armies or whatever of fascists or the organisations of fascists are going to have to face themselves injury and death at some point. And if you put it off, it just happens on a larger scale probably. Well, at least that's the experience of say, the 1940s, I suppose, for fascists. So how do we get people to do this rather unpleasant task? Well, the thing about a bigoted infrastructure is it doesn't really give us a lot of options. Like, a bigoted infrastructure doesn't have the resources to question capitalism. And in fact, it is pro-capitalist in that it's able to divide and conquer and promote disunity, which is good for the capitalist class. So let's ask briefly what capitalism is. And the answer is directed labour. Okay, it's a historical form of directed labour, but it is certainly directed labour. And so if the left are anti-capitalist, what are they interested in? Well, they'd be interested, as you move harder into the left, in non-directed labour. And that would be, what would that look like? That would be people who are remaking the world so that they can survive and flourish, but in a manner that's not directed, so that in a manner that permits more innovation and so on. And what would the innovation be around? Well, it would be around functionality, it would be around the environment that you have to live in, and it'd certainly be around your interactions with other human beings. And you'd be going for win-win-wins on this basis, and they'd be cooperative, collective win-win-wins. And that's kind of like what you're looking at with the left proposal for a replacement to capitalism. No one knows exactly what it would look like, but it's something like that. And if you don't have the theoretical resources to get there by opposing capitalism, being stuck in irrationality and in particular in irrational prejudice, then you're going to be looking at a top-down structure. And there you go. You've got your authoritarian, authoritarian orientation there. So that comes out of the definition of building a bigoted infrastructure. So we have this tight definitions, and then from that we can bring out these other characteristics that we find when we go to the wiki page on fascism, or we find when we go to the encyclopedia page of fascism, and that's a mark of a good definition. One reason why we should think along these lines is if we look at fascism themselves, they often model themselves on a military model. Okay, on an existing military template, let's say. And insofar as they do that, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at a authoritarian infrastructure. Now, it's doing harm to others, and it's expecting harm back. And for that reason, the military template is very appealing as well. So that's a dominant way of thinking about how to organise it to do harm to others and to oppose harm to yourself. And it involves, the dominant model, military model, involves tight discipline. So what you've got with fascism, what you've got with fascists building a bigoted infrastructure is a violent and hierarchical infrastructure. So it seems quite natural that that's going to be opposed, as well as for the reasons that I mentioned in respect of the Niemöller poem, and in respect of those who are targeted, standing up for themselves, and those who want to further solidarity, whilst taking issue with the building of a bigoted infrastructure. Okay, so we move on to this idea of Antifa. Now, Antifa here means anti-fascist. So on my definition, it'll be the building of a bigoted infrastructure. I think it's important to be clear about this stuff, because I don't think the human conversation is all on the same page at the moment. And it's like I said about my glossary project. Let's be as explicit and let's be as precise as we can, and let's explicate where we have to. And then I think a lot of confusion can be cleared up there, in the spirit of Wittgenstein at his best, perhaps. So recently, it's been noted that Antifa isn't an organisation. And the reason why it's been noted that it's not an organisation is because Antifa has effectively been, it has been illegalised in the current United States of America. And then there's this kind of titters on the soft left about the idiot administration has illegalised something, an organisation. It's not even an organisation, ha ha ha. I think we want to be careful of that, mainly because, let's say, I think at the time of making this vlog, about 2,200 people have been arrested in Britain on account of being a member or supporting, mainly supporting actually, Palestine Action. So supporting this group, which at least at one point is a real group, Palestine Action. Now, let's say a police officer comes up to me and I'm in the UK and that person goes, well, look, I'm going to arrest you because you're a member of Palestine Action. A line of defence I may want to adopt would be to go, well, I'm not. And what's more, I don't support Palestine Action. And unless you've got any evidence to the contrary, or you've got anything else on me, you're going to have to leave me alone. And in theory, that's right. In theory, at least. Something to note here is that the same's not true anymore of Antifa. Why not? Well, because if an agent comes up to you, or the member of the National Guard stationed in your city comes up and accuses you of being Antifa, you can go, well, look, no, I'm not Antifa. I've never been a member. I never have been a member, and I don't support Antifa. And they can go, oh, well, there's no organisation of Antifa for you to be a member of or for you to support. Like, we know that, right? Duh. It's more that you think Antifa thoughts. Now, and this is kind of like thought crime that we find as a word that's utilised and implicitly defined in George Orwell's 1984, and I recommend that novel. It's a good novel. Then you can kind of be done for this kind of thought crime of what? Well, Antifa is like it's instead of being an organisation, it's kind of like a tactic, right? It's a strategy and a tactic. The strategy is that you want to oppose the building of. Okay, put in the terms of the definition here. Right, put in the terms of the definition here. You want to oppose the building of a bigoted infrastructure, and the tactic is that you're prepared to use violence to do it. So, if you are prepared to use violence in that manner, and you're opposed to it, to the building of a bigoted infrastructure, you wind up being Antifa, and you wind up being being guilty of this thought crime, effectively. That seems quite harsh, right? We might ask, well, why is this happening? I mean, what's happening with this stuff? And the answer is, I would say that, along the lines of my definition, is that there is an attempt in, say, for instance, the existing United States of America, where Antifa has been illegalised, to build a bigoted infrastructure. And Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE, is just one example of this. They're targeting, they're targeting people on a strictly bigoted basis on how they look. So what's happening here is that the current admin wants to prevent any impediments to the building of a bigoted infrastructure, and hence I think that's the best way to understand the illegalisation of Antifa. And it's quite scary, right? Like, the building of a bigoted infrastructure is going ahead with such force and on such a level that is much more rapid than what we've known. So someone my age has known. I'm almost 60. That they don't want any impediments whatsoever. So that's quite scary, as is the kind of thought crime idea. Now, like I say, it is pretty understandable that people would oppose the building of a bigoted infrastructure, especially because, as we've unpacked it, it's not in the definitions itself, but as we've unpacked it, which is the mark of a good definitions, as I suggested, then that we wind up with these violent, top-down, hierarchical, authoritarian organisations. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Charlie Kirk. He was assassinated on the 10th of September 2025, it's this year, at a campus speaking event. Now, Charlie Kirk did seek to build a bigoted infrastructure. He was interested in a queerphobic and a white supremacist infrastructure, institutions and so on coming out of that. So Charlie Kirk can be called a fascist. Now, if people are getting in trouble for calling him that, I invite them to certainly to refer to this vlog, or more simply to use the link that I put up in the glossary project. And then if they want justification for that definition, they can come to this vlog, and we will see that on an explicated and, I would say, correct definition of fascism, Charlie Kirk was a fascist, and he was seeking to build a fascist movement. It's quite a murky incident, and you often get this kind of murkiness around what politicians use, and there's various reasons for that, but it's certainly, on face value at least, it enables you or the politician to be able to talk about things which give rise to perhaps multiple interpretations, and they can put their twist on it and make some political mileage. And there's absolutely no doubt that's happened with Charlie Kirk. Well, if you're building a bigoted infrastructure, you're expected to hurt, and you're expecting people to hurt others, and of course they're going to resist. and people are going to resist the building of your infrastructure, and at some point, because of the violent nature of that infrastructure, that it could well include violence on the fascists themselves, in this case, Charlie Kirk. So yeah, I don't think surprise is in order here. Another reason surprise isn't in order is because although this is true, due to it being such a murky incident and the so little being known of the gun man, who seems like a very confused individual, it's possible it was all a right-wing power struggle that Charlie Kirk fell foul of, and that would make sense. That could potentially make sense as well, on account of the fact that these organisations are violent and hierarchical, and so therefore they're not adverse to murdering each other, and we've already seen that with the example of the SA and Ernst Röhm. And indeed, there was a murder here around somewhere of exactly this nature, possibly about 7 or 8 years ago. Anyway, look, I will put down a link to a reasonably convincing account that I read of the Charlie Kirk murder being a right-wing power squabble, and that does seem possible. One thing I think the Charlie Kirk murder is a false flag, and I'll put a link down to what I mean by false flag. And the reason why not is because, well, it plausibly could be Antifa, or it plausibly could be a right-wing power struggle. So we've already got two pretty plausible avenues of explanation there. So we don't also need a false flag theory, and there doesn't look like any... I'm not aware of any loose ends that need tidying up with a false flag theory, so I would say not in this case, despite the fact that, coincidentally, it's on the 10th of September, and so I think that's just a coincidence. That's enough about Charlie Kirk. I'll move on to another event which bears some similarity to the Charlie Kirk event, although it has more chance of being a false flag, I would have thought, and that is an attack on an ICE facility. ICE is Immigration and Custom Enforcement over in the US. Political mileage has been made out of this as well as an Antifa attack, though rather implausibly so, considering that the only two people killed were actually detainees, immigrants. Of course, it could be incompetent or botched Antifa attack, but you're having to add extra presuppositions in and suggesting that your theory's not that great in the first place, that you have to add in these ideas that the perpetrator was incompetent, or I don't know, had a sight difficulty or something. Again, the perpetrator is very murky. The event's very murky, and it does seem very mysterious and confusing, and maybe details will emerge about it later on. I'm not prepared to make a call. More interesting here is what the Vice President said about it. He said, you've got to stop calling people neo-Nazis because it encourages people to go out and shoot others. Now, this is, of course, this is a good way to push towards the conclusion of this vlog, and it takes us back to the beginning of the vlog, where we've got a version of the argument that we handled here, namely that fascism is just, or fascist is just a tag that's used by people to justify violence on others, and doesn't really have a meaning beside that. And we've got a version of this in which instead of fascist, the word neo-Nazi was used by the Vice President. That particular argument about the neo-Nazis sort of resurrects some stuff around the Phil argument, in that if you want to call someone a Nazi, and I don't know if this was really the Vice President's point, probably not really, but if you want to call someone a Nazi, then you should be paying heed to the historical specificities involved. Now again, the limits of Phil's argument shows itself, because if those historical specificities transcend, in a sense, or can be found outside or generalised beyond the original historical German context, then if the SS cap fits, wear it. That's to say, if people are into certain insignia, and if people are into certain hero worship, certain figures, and so on, then even if they're contemporary, they should be amenable to being called Nazis. And I even think the term neo-Nazi is an interesting term, and not necessarily a bad term either, by the way, because I think it's recognising that, right? So, if you just say Nazi, well, that could refer to, people in the original German movement. But then once you put neo-Nazi in, it becomes clear that you're generalising from people and people who are into certain insignias or into certain personalities and so on, but are living in current times. And to conclude this vlog, I think that's what we're saying about all fascists, that we can use this term usefully, It tells us what people are. It tells us what they're into. It warns us about about how they're likely to behave. And it's not just a incitement to violence. It certainly is not just something that people say because they don't like someone. And it's certainly not just an incitement to violence. As we've seen with the Antifa case, it could be an incitement to violence. If so, we've seen the reasons why it would be so. And those are about opposing the building of a bigoted infrastructure, which is violent and authoritarian, and not simply about the frivolous, flippant, or completely arbitrary use of a term, fascist. All right, thanks. I hope that helped. Bye.